The war had not yet come to Guadalcanal when Sergeant Jack Brennan first set foot on the island in August 1942, but its shadow fell across the waters like storm clouds gathering at the horizon. He arrived on a transport ship with the 1st Marine Division, watching the jungle coastline emerge from the tropical haze, dense, impenetrable, absolutely hostile. Behind him, the guns of the naval escorts thundered their thunder, striking at Japanese positions inland. The smell of gunpowder mixed with salt spray and the humid air that hung so thick you could almost drink it. Brennan was a mechanic, 3rd generation from Cork, with calloused hands that understood engines the way priests understand prayer. He had no way of knowing, standing on that transport as shells whistled overhead, that he would become part of something that would later be called the Cactus Air Force, a unit so desperate, so improvised, so deeply committed to survival that it would become a turning point in the entire Pacific War. But we must begin further back, before the landing, before the Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway, before Pearl Harbor's waters still smoldered. We must begin with the understanding that America in 1941 was not yet a nation at war, though the machinery of preparation had been grinding for months. The aircraft industry, catalyzed by Lend-Lease and the growing specter of global conflict, had begun retooling with frantic energy. Factories that had produced civilian aircraft now turned out military machines at a pace that seemed miraculous and terrifying in equal measure. Among these new machines was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the twin-boomed fighter that pilots both loved and feared, fast enough to hunt the enemy's best, but demanding in the way that thoroughbreds are demanding. There was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, squat and powerful, a bruiser of an aircraft. There was the Vought F-4U Corsair, not yet perfected, still demanding pilots who could handle its quirks. And there were the mainstays of the earlier part of the war, the North American P-50, one Mustang, which would not yet become the legendary mount it would be, and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, solid and reliable if not spectacular. The Navy had the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, short-ranged, slow by later standards, but tough as a Marine's jaw and twice as reliable. These aircraft, and the men who flew them, were scattered across the Pacific theater as the Japanese Empire drove its aggressive wedge deeper into American-controlled territories. Wake Island fell in December 1941. The Philippines fell in May 1942. The Dutch East Indies fell. With each reversal, American strategic thinking coalesced around a single, desperate truth. The Navy could not be everywhere at once, and the Army Air Forces needed to be built into a credible deterrent to Japanese expansion. The aircraft carrier losses at Coral Sea and Midway in early 1942 meant that naval aviation, while valuable, could not be relied upon to cover every threatened sector. Land-based aviation had to fill the gaps. The men who would fly the Cactus Air Force began their journey long before they knew it would lead to Guadalcanal. Many of them had trained in the continental United States at fields like Eglin in Florida, where hot sun hammered the tarmac, and young pilots learned to translate engine noise and stick position into combat advantage. They came from every corner of America, farm boys and city kids, engineering school graduates and mechanics who had worked their way up from the ground crews. Some had seen action already in the Europe theater, ferrying aircraft or flying defensive patrols. Most were young enough that the war was the most significant thing that had ever happened to them, and probably ever would. They had little understanding of strategy or grand tactics. They understood, with absolute clarity, that their job was to get their aircraft into the air, locate the enemy, shoot them down, and come home. Major John Smith, who would become the de facto commander of the Cactus Air Force, was a career pilot with the steady competence of a man who understood aircraft not as machines but as extensions of will. He had studied tactics, read the reports, filtering back from pilots who had actually tangled with the Zero, the Mitsubishi A-6M, and understood that American fighters were fundamentally different machines with fundamentally different strengths. American fighters were faster at altitude, could dive like stones and accelerate rapidly, and turned more slowly than their Japanese counterparts. This was not a design flaw, it was a philosophical choice. American aircraft were built by people who believed in speed and power. Japanese aircraft were built by people who believed in maneuverability and efficiency. The two approaches could not be more opposed, and victory in combat between them would belong to the pilot who understood his own aircraft's advantages and refused to be drawn into fighting on his opponent's terms. Smith had read the combat reports from China, where American volunteer pilots flying P-40 Warhawks had fought Japanese Zeros over Chinese territory. The reports all said the same thing: never turn with a Zero, never try to dogfight it in its preferred realm of tight maneuvering. Instead, you climbed above it if possible, dove through its formation firing guns, and got away using your altitude advantage and superior speed in the dive. You attacked and departed. You did not linger. The Zeros were flown by pilots who had been fighting since 1,937 inches China, men with vast experience and honed reflexes, but they remained human. Concentrate them hard, damage them severely, and they would break off and return to base. It was not heroic. It was not romantic. It was exactly what they needed to understand. By August 1942, the strategic situation had crystallized enough to trigger Operation Watchtower, a massive undertaking designed to roll back Japanese expansion in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield on the island of Guadalcanal at a location the Americans called Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. If this airfield became operational under Japanese control, their reach into the Solomon Islands would extend dangerously close to Australian territory. The threat was too great to ignore. American naval planners understood that without control of the air around Guadalcanal, no American force could land there successfully and stay there. Conversely, with an operational airfield in American hands, American air power could dominate the surrounding waters and prevent Japanese reinforcement. The 1st Marine Division, hastily assembled and not yet fully trained, was dispatched to seize the island and hold it. The assumption, in that optimistic way of military plans, was that air support would be provided by land-based fighters operating from nearby American airfields in the New Hebrides, Fiji, and other Pacific outposts. But distances were far greater than anticipated in the comfortable surroundings of strategic planning. A P-40 Warhawk had an effective range of barely 350 miles. Sending fighters from the New Hebrides to Guadalcanal and back was a mission that left almost no margin for error, no fuel for maneuvering, no cushion for unexpected circumstances. Logistics were a nightmare that would never fully resolve, even after months of effort. On the 7th of August 1942, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in Operation Watchtower. The initial assault met with limited Japanese resistance. The defending garrison, caught off guard, retreated to defensive positions inland. The Marines secured Henderson Field, which the Japanese had abandoned in incomplete condition, and the island itself fell into American hands, at least for the moment. But this was not an end. It was a beginning, and the beginning of something far harder than the initial landing Dick had suggested. The Japanese would not surrender control of the island quietly. In fact, they were already preparing reinforcements, gathering warships and transports from their naval bases in the New Britain and Bougainville region, planning to retake what had been taken from them. They understood, as the Americans did, that Guadalcanal was more than just an island. It was a foothold, a promise, and a symbol. And it was into this situation, into this incomplete airfield surrounded by jungle that still held Japanese soldiers, that the first handful of fighters began to assemble what would become the Cactus Air Force. The name came from the radio call sign, a simple operational designation that would echo through months of desperate fighting. The pilots began arriving in late August, some ferried in by transport aircraft that made the journey from the New Hebrides, some flying in themselves on missions that tested the limits of their fuel calculations. The first operational squadrons to arrive were Marine fighters, pilots from VMF 223 and VMF 224, Wildcat drivers, men who understood that they were being sent into the heat of it with inadequate numbers and inadequate resources. A Wildcat could carry perhaps 130 gallons of fuel in its tanks, and at cruise speed, that meant perhaps 4 to 5 hours aloft before empty. Of that time, the pilot had to account for the distance from Guadalcanal to the threat zone, the distance back, a reserve's margin, and perhaps 15 or 20 minutes of actual combat time. It was like being asked to fight with one hand tied behind your back before you started. Behind the Marines came the Army Air Force's pilots, some fresh from the States and the training pipeline, some with previous combat experience from other theaters. They flew P-40 Warhawks, those squat, powerful, rugged aircraft that had been the mainstay of early American air operations. The P-40 was not a good high-altitude fighter. It lacked the supercharger sophistication that modern fighters were beginning to receive, but down low, it was sturdy, reliable, and capable of absorbing punishment that would bring down more delicate aircraft. A P-40 could take machine gun fire and keep flying. It could lose an engine, just the one engine, and the pilot might still get back to base. It was not glamorous, but it was honest in its capabilities, and in the desperate calculus of August 1942, that honesty was valuable. Sergeant Brennan's first glimpse of Henderson Field shocked him with its rawness. The runway was simply a cleared strip of coral and packed earth, vulnerable to mortar fire, easily cratered by bombing, always precarious. Rain turned sections of it to mud, and the pilots cursed the endless maintenance crews who labored to keep it passable. The revetments where they parked the fighters were nothing more than sandbag walls and palm logs, offering some protection from blast and fragmentation, but hardly impregnable to determine bombing. There was no hangar. Aircraft maintenance was done under the blazing sun or in hastily constructed tent structures that offered more shade than shelter. The men worked in shifts that stretched to 14 hours, 16 sometimes, covered in grease and sweat, watching the sky constantly for the first sign of the expected Japanese counterattack. That counterattack came on the 20th of August, 1942, just 2 weeks after the Marines landed. Japanese fighters from Rabaul, a major Japanese airbase in New Britain, swept down from the North Zeros, flown by experienced pilots, defending their territory against this American incursion. The Cactus pilots, numbering fewer than 30 available for flight, scrambled to intercept. The fight was vicious and brief, lasting perhaps 20 minutes before the Japanese, low on fuel, broke off the engagement and turned for home. The Americans lost several pilots, but also damaged enough Japanese aircraft that they could claim a tactical success. It was a strategic stalemate, but a psychological victory for men who had feared they were being sent to die as a mere gesture to the gods of strategy. But August 20th was only the beginning of what would become a daily trial. The Japanese were determined to eliminate the American foothold. They established a routine that would persist through the entire campaign. During daylight hours, the air belonged for the most part to the Americans because Japanese fighters based on Rabaul were at the extreme limit of their range, perhaps 90 minutes of flight time over Guadalcanal before they had to return. But in the late afternoon, as American fighters ran low on fuel and prepared to land, the Japanese would come, sometimes singly, sometimes in coordinated formations of dozens of fighters and bombers. The Americans called these the Tokyo Express runs or rat runs fast. Japanese warships would race down the channel between the islands, land reinforcements and supplies, and withdraw before dawn. With each pass down the channel, they brought more fighters, more bombers, more danger. The Cactus pilots knew that eventually they might wake up one morning and find themselves with no functioning aircraft and no fuel to fly what remained. That day might be tomorrow, might be next week, but it was coming unless they could somehow defeat mathematics. The reality of Cactus Air Force operations was far grimmer than any official report could convey. There was never, at any point, an adequate supply of anything. Gasoline arrived in drums, often partially leaked during transport or damaged by shrapnel. Ammunition came in insufficient quantities. Aircraft parts were scavenged from damaged planes to keep others flying. If your Wildcat was hit by flak and you had to bail out over friendly territory, the remaining flyable Wildcats would cannibalize every usable component. Hydraulic lines from your destroyed plane might become hydraulic lines for another. Radio equipment would be pulled out and installed in an aircraft that needed it more urgently. Pilots flew aircraft that would never pass inspection in peacetime, with fabric patches over bullet holes, with engines that ran rough and hydraulics that were temperamental. They flew them anyway, because the alternative was to abandon the island and let the Japanese reinforce. Major Smith established a rigid command structure that would become increasingly complex as the weeks progressed. Pilots were rotated out when they reached some invisible threshold of exhaustion, no official rule, but an understanding that if you flew too long without rest, you would make the error that got you killed. But the rotation points got pushed further and further as the need became more desperate. Some pilots flew 40, 50, 60 combat missions in the months of the Cactus campaign. Captain Marion, a Marine with steady competence, found himself flying multiple missions per day, wake at dawn to prepare the aircraft, flight in the early morning to establish air superiority before the main attacks came, another flight in the afternoon, sometimes a third if the situation demanded it. The human body could withstand this only for so long before the pilot began to hallucinate from exhaustion, before reaction time slowed perceptibly, before the mistakes began. The Japanese response was methodical and utterly committed. They understood that Henderson Field was the American toe in the door of the Solomon Islands, and they were determined to pry it out before it could be expanded into something that threatened their entire position in the South Pacific. Beginning with the Zeros escorting bombers, they escalated to sending fighter sweeps of 50 or more aircraft. The Americans never had that many fighters available at any single moment. On some days, they could put up perhaps 15 aircraft against formations 2 or 3 times that size. How they survived is a question that military historians still debate. The answer lies partly in the terrain. The mountains and jungles of Guadalcanal provided protection and hiding places, valleys where aircraft could take cover, positions where American pilots could establish ambushes if they knew the enemy was coming. It lies partly in the American pilots' willingness to accept odds that should have been fatal, and it lies partly in the American tactical doctrine that was emerging from the daily combat: never fight the enemy on his terms. One instance exemplifies the desperation that defined Cactus operations. On the 9th of September, 1942, the Japanese sent 2 separate bomber formations, trying to overwhelm the American fighters by arriving from different directions. The Cactus pilots scrambled everything. They had 19 fighters against waves of Japanese bombers protected by Zeros. The fight was a whirling, desperate thing that lasted nearly an hour, an eternity in terms of aerial combat. American P-42s dove through the Japanese formations, firing their machine guns and cannons, then climbing away, trading altitude for speed. Wildcats turned inside the Zeros where they could, but mostly turned away when they couldn't and dove for speed instead. The bombers, less maneuverable than their escorts, became the prey, but the Japanese pilot had learned the same lessons as the Americans, and they had reinforced their bomber formations with experienced fighters. The air battle was a blur of engine noise and traces, of radio calls that sometimes came through clear and sometimes were lost in static. In the end, the Americans claimed to have shot down 9 Japanese aircraft. Later analysis suggested the real number was perhaps 4 or 5. But the bombers, harassed and distracted, dropped their ordnance less accurately than they otherwise might have, and Henderson Field remained operational. The runway was cratered by several bombs, but the mechanics and airfield personnel set to work immediately with picks and shovels, and by evening, it was usable again. The pilots began to know each other, with the intimacy of men who share extreme danger regularly. First Lieutenant Richard Bong, who would eventually become America's top ace with 40 victories, was still a young man then, still relatively inexperienced, but already showing the cold precision and quick reactions that would define his career. Captain Joe Foss, another Marine whose name would become famous in aviation circles, flew with the steady confidence of a man born to combat flying. He flew P-40 Warhawks when he could, F-4U Corsairs when they arrived, anything he was assigned, treating each aircraft as a trusted mount. Major Carl described his own state of mind during this period with brutal honesty in letters home that were heavily censored by military intelligence, a kind of dissociation where fear and fatigue created a zone of automatic action. You flew because flying was what you did. Whether you would survive was increasingly irrelevant to the calculation. You worried about it the way you worried about the weather present, inevitable, but ultimately not something you could control. The aircraft themselves told a story of constant attrition and desperate maintenance. The F-4F Wildcat, the mainstay of the Marine Forces, was now several years old by 1942 standards, having been designed in the mid-1930 seconds. It was never intended to be a match for the Mitsubishi Zero in a turning fight. It was slower and less maneuverable. But it was tough, with armor protection around the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that could withstand hits that would cause other aircraft to catch fire. The P-40 Warhawk was even older as a design, dating to the late 1930 seconds, but it had been continuously upgraded and improved. Both aircraft had their fans and their detractors among the pilots. A P-40 pilot would argue that his aircraft was more reliable and simpler to maintain. A Wildcat pilot would counter that the Wildcat was more robust and could take more damage. The truth was that both aircraft were adequate to their tasks if the pilots who flew them understood their limitations and flew accordingly. By October 1942, 2 months into the campaign, the situation had become both more established and more precarious. The Americans had brought in additional aircraft, more P-40 seconds, P-39 seconds, the Bell fighter that many pilots considered their worst aircraft, with poor high-altitude performance and a tendency to have directional stability problems, but useful in low-level work if you understood its quirks. And eventually, the first P-38 Lightnings began to arrive. The P-38 was a revelation when it appeared. Twin engines, a top speed that could match or exceed the Zero in level flight, and a rate of climb that let American pilots dictate the terms of engagement. But there were not many of them initially, perhaps 4 or 5, and they had problems of their own. The first versions had altitude supercharger issues that limited their maximum ceiling to below what would have been optimal, and the twin booms could confuse friendly anti-aircraft gunners who sometimes fired on them thinking they were Japanese aircraft. Sergeant Brennan and the ground crews were running on fumes, both literal and figurative. Fuel had to be carefully rationed. Every gallon burned in a training flight was a gallon not available for combat. The mechanics learned to look at an aircraft and instantly assess what needed to be done to get it flying again. They developed a kind of hardened pragmatism. If the engine still turned over and the wings were mostly attached, it was good enough to fly. They developed shortcuts that would have horrified peacetime aviation authorities. They also developed something that official reports never quite captured, a sense of fellowship with the pilots that transcended normal rank structures. A pilot whose Wildcat had been brought back to readiness by Brennan's team, despite what should have been catastrophic damage from flak, would instinctively try a little harder to bring that plane back again. He would fly it more carefully, return it to base gently, treat it with respect, because he understood the hours of labor that had gone into making it fly. There was no mystical connection, but there was something, a web of mutual obligation and shared risk that made the whole enterprise work. The Japanese never quite accepted that they couldn't dislodge the Americans through air power alone. In late August and September, they tried massive, coordinated raids. By October, they were sending capital ships down the channel to shell Henderson Field at night. The American pilots would sleep through the shell fire in their foxholes, feeling the earth shake, hearing the screaming sound of incoming shells, understanding in a visceral way that this could end at any moment. They would wake at dawn to see the airfield cratered but, somehow, still operational. There was a kind of cosmic absurdity to it. The Japanese would bombard, the Americans would repair. The next day would bring the same ritual, endlessly repeating. Brennan had seen men killed by shell fire, had seen revetments collapsed by near misses, had seen aircraft that were perfectly flyable the night before, reduced to twisted metal by shrapnel. He learned not to think about these things too much, to focus on the immediate task at hand. The fundamental balance was beginning to shift in ways that no single day's combat could fully reveal. The Japanese had started the war with highly trained pilots, most of whom had been in continuous combat since China in 1937. They were better in individual fighter versus fighter contests than the Americans on average. But the Japanese training system did not rotate experienced pilots home to train new replacements. Instead, the experienced pilots stayed in combat until they were killed, and experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, America was building a system where successful pilots would eventually rotate home, their experience preserved and transmitted to new trainees. American industry was producing aircraft faster than the Japanese could build them. American training was producing pilots faster than the Japanese could train them. It was a tortoise and hare race in slow motion, and the Americans, for the first time, were the tortoise, steady, relentless, seemingly inexhaustible. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force were not yet aware of this strategic transformation. They were too busy surviving the next mission, the next scramble, the next encounter with an enemy that, on a daily basis, seemed every bit as formidable as it had been at the beginning. Captain Marion would later write that the continuous stress was almost worse than any single battle could have been. You knew that tomorrow would bring another fight, and the day after that, and the day after that. The question was not if you would encounter the enemy, but when and whether you would. Make mistakes that day that you would not survive. You could manage acute stress, the tension of actual combat because it existed in a confined time frame. But chronic stress, the kind that came from knowing that the routine would never end, that stretched into weeks and months, that eroded your confidence one small decision at a time, was something else entirely. By November, 3 months into the campaign, the strategic situation on the ground had stabilized into a bloody stalemate. The Japanese could not push the Americans into the sea without air superiority, and the Cactus Air Force, through a combination of courage, skill, and increasingly adequate numbers of aircraft, was denying them that superiority. The pilots had developed tactics that played to American strengths. They eschewed the dogfighting that favored the Zero and instead relied on speed, altitude, and teamwork. 4 fighters would fly together, with 2 higher and back as cover. The pair below would bounce the enemy formation, attack, and break away, ideally with the top pair swooping down to bounce any Japanese fighters that tried to follow. It was simple in concept, devastating in execution, if everyone understood the discipline required to make it work. Not every pilot had that discipline. Some were tempted to linger after an attack, to try to score another kill, and these pilots often became casualties. Sergeant Brennan had been reassigned by November to the main aircraft maintenance section. He had proven himself adept at figuring out problems and implementing solutions under pressure. He found himself responsible for keeping a growing fleet of damaged and partly repaired aircraft turning into combat-ready fighters. One day, he would spend replacing a supercharger compressor that had been damaged by flak, understanding instinctively what needed to be done. The next day, he would be figuring out how to jury-rig a landing gear from spare parts, scavenged from a P-40 that had crashed on landing. He had to become an engineer through sheer necessity, learning on the job at an accelerated pace that would have taken peacetime mechanics years to master. The mechanics became more skilled through necessity than any training could have made them. They had to be, or their pilots would die. The Japanese made one more major push in mid-November. They sent a bombardment force down the channel with the explicit goal of reducing Henderson Field to unusable status before their own aircraft attacked. The American pilots that night slept in foxholes as shells exploded around them. Sergeant Brennan huddled with the other mechanics and ground crew, feeling the earth shake, understanding in a visceral way that this could end at any moment, that his entire tent could be obliterated by some random shellfire, and there was literally nothing he could do about it except wait. He thought about his mother in Cork, whom he had not seen in 2 years. He thought about his sister, who had written him 2 letters that had arrived within the same week in October. He thought about the aircraft he had worked on that day, hoping they were parked far enough from where the shells were landing. The bombardment lasted several hours. When dawn broke, the airfield was pocked with craters, and for one terrible moment, Brennan and the others wondered if they had been reduced to complete non-functionality. But the Japanese naval gunfire had not been entirely accurate, and American countermeasures fragmentary naval forces that had engaged the Japanese bombardment force had disrupted their accuracy. Key sections of the runway remained usable. The mechanics and the airfield personnel attacked the repairs with desperate energy. By mid-morning, the first fighters were launching. By afternoon, the Cactus pilots were engaging another wave of enemy bombers and fighters. The fighting was fierce, and by the day's end, both sides had suffered significant losses, but Henderson Field remained American, and the Japanese, having failed to eliminate the threat from the air, could not sustain their ground forces without it. That bombardment on November 13–14 marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese drive to retake Guadalcanal. They would continue to contest the island for months, but the window for achieving a decisive victory had closed. The Cactus Air Force, composed of fewer than 200 pilots at its peak, had held the line long enough for American reinforcements and improved logistics to make themselves felt. It was a victory that no one could celebrate much. The cost in pilots lost, aircraft destroyed, and men wounded or killed was high. But it was a victory, and it meant that the Japanese would eventually have to give up the island, and with it, the momentum in the Pacific War. The campaign continued through the fall and winter of 1942 and into early 1943. The Cactus pilots flew hundreds of combat missions. Some died, their aircraft shot down, or mechanical failure at critical moments, sending them into the jungle or the sea. Some were wounded and evacuated to rear hospitals where they would slowly heal, if they were lucky. Some simply rotated home when their tour was complete, joining the steady stream of pilots, returning to the States with stories that would influence the entire American air war that followed. The emphasis on tactical teamwork, on extending fighter range through careful fuel management and intelligent mission planning, on accepting odds and surviving through discipline rather than individual heroism, these lessons, learned in the furnace of Guadalcanal, would ripple through American fighter operations worldwide. By December 1942, the situation had become almost routine in its danger. The daily rhythm was established: alert before dawn, perhaps a scramble at first light to engage incoming bombers, another scramble in the afternoon. The pilots learned to sleep in snatches, to eat whatever was available without paying, much attention to taste, to check their parachutes with the kind of automatic ritual that pilots everywhere practice. They learned that fear was something you could acknowledge and then set aside, that it was actually useful because it kept you sharp. They learned that being tired was normal, and that you could function while tired if you had to. Sergeant Brennan remained at Henderson Field through the entire campaign. By March 1943, when the Americans had fully consolidated their position and established unchallenged air superiority over the island, he was one of the most experienced maintenance personnel on the field. He had learned to fix things that were not supposed to be fixable. He had learned to make decisions instantly about whether an aircraft could be made combat-ready on any given day. He had learned to accept that some of the pilots he had worked with whose aircraft he had prepared for missions would not come back. He had seen the quiet, private grief of his fellow mechanics when they learned that a pilot they had been working with was confirmed dead. He had learned to separate the emotional cost from the practical necessity. The work had to continue. The legacy of the Cactus Air Force was not dramatic in the way that singular battles sometimes are. There was no moment where everything changed suddenly. Instead, there was a slow, grinding victory that manifested in the growing effectiveness of American air power and the corresponding decline of Japanese air power. The Zeros that the Cactus pilots faced in March 1943 were flown by men with far less experience than the pilots of August 1942. The gap in pilot experience, which had favored Japan in the early months, had reversed. American pilots were arriving in theater with better training that incorporated the hard-won lessons of Guadalcanal. American aircraft were becoming more capable new Corsairs, arriving with improved engines, new P-38 seconds with refined supercharger systems. And the tactics that had been improvised and perfected under fire were now being systematized and taught to every new fighter pilot. The Cactus Air Force was officially deactivated in 1943 as the campaign wound down and American forces prepared to move on to the next objective. The pilots who had been part of it scattered across the Pacific theater. Some would rise to high rank and command entire wings or even air forces. Some would die in later campaigns, their luck eventually running out. Some would survive the entire war and return home to pursue peacetime careers. but all of them would carry something of Guadalcanal with them, the understanding of what was possible when you accepted that you might die today but flew anyway, when you worked with worn-out equipment and made it do things the designers never imagined, when you learned discipline not because it was ordered but because it was the only thing that kept you alive. Sergeant Brennan eventually made Sergeant Major and spent the rest of the war following the air war westward across the Pacific. He saw action at Rabaul, at the Gilberts, at the Marianas, at the Philippines. He ended the war in the Philippines, having helped maintain aircraft through some of the heaviest fighting in the Pacific campaign. He came home in 1945 and found work as a mechanic in Arizona, which seemed a strange place to him at first, flat and hot and nothing like Cork, with none of the green and the soft rain of home. But Arizona had clear skies and plains, and he understood that language perfectly. He never spoke much about the war except to other veterans, and even then, only in the most matter-of-fact terms. The real cost of war was something that could not be easily conveyed in words. It existed in the dreams he had sometimes, in the way he would freeze momentarily when he heard loud noises, in the satisfaction he felt when he saw a well-maintained aircraft that he knew would be reliable. The Japanese would eventually be forced from Guadalcanal in January 1943, though the fighting would continue in other islands throughout the Solomon Chain. They would attempt to establish their next defensive line through the Solomon Islands and beyond, eventually being pushed back toward their homeland. American air power would pursue them, growing stronger with each island secured, each new airfield built, each increment of industrial capacity translated into aircraft and pilots and fuel. The Cactus Air Force was only one act in a very long war. But it was perhaps the act that proved the turning point not through overwhelming strength, but through the willingness to hold a line with inadequate means, through the marriage of mechanical skill and flying ability, through the understanding that sometimes what matters is not whether you have everything you need, but whether you can make do with what you have. The Wildcats and P-42s that flew from Henderson Field were not the most advanced aircraft in the world. The pilots who flew them were not drawn from any elite selection process. They were ordinary Americans, many of them barely out of their teens. The mechanics who maintained them worked in conditions that violated every peacetime safety standard. But together, they accomplished something remarkable. They proved that American resolve, American ingenuity, and American courage applied through effective tactics and sustained commitment could overcome even a formidable and ruthless enemy. They proved it not through speeches or grand gestures, but through daily repetition, through the quiet confidence that comes from surviving what should have killed you, through the understanding that the war would be won, not on any single day, but through accumulation of victories that were too small to mention individually, but whose total was irresistible. The tactical innovations that emerged from Guadalcanal, 4 plane formations with mutual support, the emphasis on using speed and altitude, rather than maneuverability, the careful management of fuel and ammunition, the rotation of experienced pilots to training duty became the standard doctrine of American fighter operations for the remainder of the war. When new fighters arrived in theater with better engines and better aerodynamics, they carried with them pilots who had learned their lessons under fire. The experience was transferable. The knowledge was transmissible. The next generation of fighters, the P-38 Lightnings in their refined form, the Corsairs with their later engines, the P-51 Mustangs that would eventually dominate the air war in the Pacific, all benefited from the hard-won wisdom of the Cactus Air Force. By the time the Cactus Air Force was deactivated, the American air war machine had been fundamentally transformed. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal about fuel efficiency, about tactical formations, about the importance of rotating experienced pilots home to train new ones, about the critical role of ground personnel in determining whether air combat operations would succeed or fail, about the necessity of accepting that you cannot achieve perfection and therefore must make do with what is adequate, became doctrine that spread throughout the American Air Forces. The P-38, which had not been ready in August 1942, and indeed would not appear in significant numbers until later in the campaign, eventually became the dominant high-altitude fighter in the Pacific by 1944. The P-51 Mustang, which had not appeared in theater during the Cactus campaign, would eventually dominate fighter operations in both the European and Pacific theaters. But these aircraft carried with them the lessons of the earlier struggle, taught by pilots who had learned them in desperation and danger. The story of the Cactus Air Force cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of courage overcoming odds, though there was certainly no shortage of courage. It was also a story of logistics and mechanics, of fuel and aircraft parts, of men who understood that victory in modern warfare is not won by individuals, but by coordinated teams. It was the story of a ground crew member like Sergeant Brennan, whose mechanical skill and dedication to his work translated directly into pilot survivability. It was the story of pilots who understood that their job was not to achieve glory or individual heroism, but to accomplish a mission and come home alive if possible, to pass on to the next rotation of pilots the lessons they had learned so dearly. When historians look back on the turning point of the Pacific War, they often point to large naval battles or island campaigns with impressive numbers and strategic sweep. But they might equally point to a struggling group of mechanics and pilots on an unfinished airfield in the Solomon Islands, working with equipment that was failing, flying missions that should not have succeeded, displaying a quiet competence that turned an almost certain defeat into an improbable victory. That is the legacy of the Cactus Air Force. Not that they were exceptional individuals doing exceptional things, but that they were ordinary people who did necessary things in extraordinary circumstances, and in doing so, changed the course of history. They did not do it because they were ordered to, or because they wanted to. They did it because it was the only thing to do, and because the alternative failure was unthinkable.